my name is Dana White. Welcome to the Myth Salon. Tonight we have Gus Cwik and Carolyn bringing us part 2 of Witnessing with Compassion. Here's our chaotic world, brought even more chaotic by the fact that those of you who know me know how long I've been at my home in Santa Monica. My wife and I are moving after 40 years in this place. On Valentine's Day, we went up to Santa Cruz, took a walk in the redwoods, and thought, we could live in a place like this. So we set into motion the plan, and you know how little time has lapsed since Valentine's Day. We put our home on the market, sold it. Don't exactly know where we're going to live up in Santa Cruz, but we know where we're not going to be living after June. So add that to the chaotic stream of international relations with Russia and Ukraine. And so before we begin, I would like to open us up with a moment of silence. Here's our singing bowl. I'd like to open tonight with a short poem by Ursula Le Guin, who provided one of the Tao Te Ching translations that I used as a source for my own interpretations of the Tao Te Ching that are all online now. It's called Come to Dust. Spirit, rehearse the journeys of the body that are to come, the motions of the matter that held you. Rise up in the smoke of Palo Santo. Fall to the earth in the falling rain. Sink in. Sink down to the farthest roots. Mount slowly in the rising sap to the branches, the crown, the leaf tips. Come down to earth as leaves in autumn to lie in the patient rot of winter. Rise again in spring's green fountains. Drift in sunlight with the sacred pollen to fall in blessing. All earth's dust has been life, held soul is holy. We live and are surrounded by change. Change is what makes everything possible. The moment that we're in, it's an illusion. It's going to vanish as we occupy it. So I'd like to introduce everyone that we're all with tonight. I'm Dana White, co-founder of the Myth Salon. I'm a producer and publisher and a contributing member of the faculty of Pacifica's Myth PhD program. My partner in the Myth Salon since its inception 5 years ago is Dr. Will Lynn, and tonight he's coming to us from the hills of Alabama. Will is the founder of mythhouse.org, and he chairs the general education department at Hushin College, where he teaches myth to storytellers. So bear with me, please, while I try my hand at introducing our panel tonight. Dr. Diane Sherwood co-authored the book with the late analyst Joseph L. Henderson, relating a series of alchemical illuminations to the process of depth transformation of the psyche, the symbolic alchemy of the splendor solis. She has published on a wide range of topics and serves as a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Analytical Psychology. She's a certified Jungian psychoanalyst, a child and adolescent analyst, and a teaching member of the Sandplay Therapists of America. Dr. Tom Singer, it's his first time with us, I believe, Tom. He's a psychiatrist and Jungian psychoanalyst who lives and practices in the San Francisco Bay Area. He has written and edited many books, including Who's the Patient Here?, A Fan's Guide to Baseball Fever, The Cultural Complex, Ancient Greece, Modern Psyche, Psyche in the City, A Soul's Guide to the Modern City, Initiation, The Living Reality of an Archetype, and most recently, Placing Psyche, Exploring Cultural Complexes in Australia. All right. Tonight we are enjoying the second part of a two-part presentation brought to us by Drs. Carolyn Bates and Gus Cwik. Carolyn is a psychologist and Jungian analyst in Austin, Texas. She currently serves as president of the Texas Seminar of the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts Training Institute. Over the last 3 decades, she has offered workshops and lectures on ethics and boundary violations, technology's influence within the collective, the symbolism of pilgrimage, the feminine archetype in dreams and fairy tales, and the phenomenon of synchronicity and trauma in the collective. She has published on the influence of cultural and political events on the analytical container, and she recently set aside an avid motorcycling passion for the more grounded practice of permaculture gardening. But she continues to support motorcycle safety and awareness with a keen appreciation for the archetypal nature of the mechanical horse. Dr. Gus Cwik is a clinical psychologist, hypnotherapist, and Jungian analyst in private practice in Chicago. He is a member of the Chicago Society of Jungian Analysts and the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts. He is also on the editorial board of the Journal of Analytical Psychology. Gus was co-director of training of the Analyst Training Program and co-director of the Clinical Training Program in Analytical Psychotherapy at the Jung Institute in Chicago. He has published articles on thirdness, the structure of analysis, alchemy, supervision, dreams, and active imagination. Excellent, everyone. I would like now to turn this over to Gus and Carolyn, and let's enjoy compassionate witnessing.
Thank you, Dana. This is kind of exciting to be here. This is tonight is part 2 of a 2-part presentation that Gus and I first gave to the Interregional Training Institute in November of 2019, which truly does seem like a lifetime ago, and in some ways it was. I'd like to give you a little bit of background on how this, what we're going to do tonight, came to be. The morning of that presentation, what was planned was that Gus and I would follow 2 presentations in November of 2019 at the Interregional. The first was a panel that was addressing feminine rage, and the second, a lecture that looked at the violence of rape as portrayed in ancient art. Gus had planned to offer his paper on the alchemy of lunar consciousness and compassionate witnessing that you heard 2 weeks ago in more depth. And he had invited me to co-present with him in some way that we would figure out somewhere down the line. So I accepted his gracious invitation and then went to work on a completely different presentation altogether. One about the MeToo movement that I was to give to the Jung Society in Austin. For that lecture, I had amplified 2 ancient stories to look at gender bias, the story of the rape of Medusa and the creation story from the Judeo-Christian tradition, the story of Adam and Eve. And for that lecture, I relied on Mark Twain's personification of the feminine and masculine archetypes from his book entitled The Diaries of Adam and Eve. Twain's depiction included no dialogue whatsoever between these two ancient beings. Instead, he wrote about their reveries, their inner musings in response to their discovery of creation, of the garden, and their discovery of themselves, and their discovery of one another. Now, one does not write about nor teach such material without that material getting inside one's psyche and then being informed by one's own unconscious. It's a kind of dance with the material that grows one's thinking, as Gus noted in ago, when he described how his own thinking about lunar consciousness had developed over time. First, he thought about it in the framework of the observing ego and that distant kind of whispering experience we call reverie. Then it grew into an understanding of good enough holding and analytical mindfulness. And most recently, his ideas of lunar consciousness have evolved into the active experience of compassionate witnessing. The same thing was happening in parallel for me as I was wrestling with how to break out of the tensions embedded in gender biases. I had been focusing on how, when we think of those archetypes expressed culturally, we can see how a patriarchy that is more heavily identified with aspects of the masculine remains privileged by virtue of those masculine attributes that are so culturally venerated. And this has a bearing in Western culture for how the feminine is then too often relegated to the realm of lesser. There is such tension between these two culturally informed constellations, and I didn't know that a way of bridging that tension was about to emerge from my own unconscious. Because in all honesty, when I wrapped up that MeToo lecture in Austin, I was certain that I was done with the creation story of Adam and Eve, but clearly it was not done with me. A few hours after giving that lecture that had drawn on Mark Twain's work, as I fell asleep, I thought, I am so glad that's behind me. And I was genuinely ready to let my mind rest. But archetypal energies have their own intentions, and I woke up sometime after midnight, hearing in my mind a woman's voice, speaking, protesting, loudly. It was Eve's voice, speaking to me in the first person, and remembering the advice given to me long ago by my colleague Paul Kugler on the nature of writing, who told me, dip your net in the water when the fish are near the boat. I got up and began writing down what was streaming into my mind. And as I did, I realized I was being pulled to convey something about this one particular story from the Judeo-Christian realm, a story that for generations has, both subtly and not so subtly, informed and justified so many of the gender biases and gender-aligned power structures that course through Western culture, including those biases that promote toxic masculinity and systemic disadvantages toward women. The question that was forming in my mind as I wrote that morning was this: what if the feminine and masculine archetypes portrayed in that story could find voice and speak to one another? What if they could, with compassionate witnessing, reflect together on how the imbalance between them continues to recreate itself? What if they could together imagine from a new requirement how that imbalance might be deconstructed? It has been a true joy to work with Gus as we collaborated on this dialogue, bringing in the alchemical message of compassionate witnessing that in turn creates the third. And it has also been a joy to collaborate with the unconscious, both his and mine, and to allow the unfolding of a kind of mythopoetic dialogue. Following this dialogue that we're going to do, Gus will play a brief slideshow that we hope will invite you into a meditative moment of reflection on the material, and then we'll all come together for discussion. So we're going to excuse ourselves for a minute or so while we slip into our surroundings. Thank you.
While Gus and Carolyn are disappearing behind the folds of what we're going to witness, let's have a moment of silence while we think about the issues that are most front and center in our lives. I might suggest that some of that has to do with the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Adam,
Yes, Steve?
Adam, I want to renegotiate the terms. I'm lodging a formal protest
What now?
against that very attitude, Adam. That attitude that what matters to me and my kind is seen as an annoyance, and so I must surmise that on some level it is seen as a threat.
All right. I'll really try to listen.
I've been thinking, all these millennia after paradise, I've been thinking about what was put into motion that day.
And what brought on these thoughts, Eve?
Watching my daughters, and my daughters' daughters, and their daughters down through the ages. Speaking with other expressions of First Woman, with Embla, Sybil, Lilith, and Nut. I've been speaking to the salty daughters of Tiamat, the unnamed daughters of Izanami, and with the women crafted from the feathers of bald eagle. I've talked with Gaia herself. She is burning, Adam. We are all burning. Each tell me the same thing. They've watched so many human paths unfold in magnificent ways and in horrific ways. And all these conversations have left me thinking about the human path that unfolded from us, from our skewed beginnings, from our original misunderstanding of the whole goddamned thing. And don't look at me that way. It's not a curse. It's how the writers of history described what he did.
You want to rewrite history?
I want to correct the conclusions that were drawn, yes. Conclusions that my decision ruined a good thing. Conclusions that have supported this patriarchy's punishment and repression of my kind. You've been taken with this thing called psychology for the past 100 years. Call it the return of the repressed, if you like.
Now, that usually comes with a price.
Oh, you bet your sweet fig leaf it does. Adam, I just wanted to reach. That was all. I wanted to reach beyond what we knew. Did that really need to be framed as the ultimate transgression? Did my sex, did the female form itself have to suffer the embodiment of shame and trauma that followed that single decision?
You think he didn't reach the right conclusion?
I think it was a failure of imagination on his part, yes. Look, we were first man and woman. We were archetypes made human, for God's sake. No pun intended. At our first emergence, we were in balance, at peace. We lived in a state of continual wonder. We explored everything, Adam, without fear. We discovered so much without being harmed and without doing harm.
Well, I remember we were surrounded by every creature one could ever imagine, and we had such interesting conversations with them. You were forever naming things, Eve. Every being you came upon, you gave them name.
I loved them, and they loved me. It was a time of greening, and there was no strife, only contentment.
It was the original matrix, unified and balanced.
With no hint of individuation in sight.
We had just about everything we could want, except
There was this one thing. There was always just this one thing. But if there hadn't been Adam, there would have been no change, no growth, no development, because there would have been no reaching.
there was just this one thing we weren't supposed to do. That tree, anchored in the middle of the garden, anchoring the garden itself. Everything was ours except its fruit. Just its fruit was off limits, Eve. We'd been warned. If we ate it, we would surely die.
And that was the beginning of the tension of opposites between us, wasn't it? To be aware or not to be aware. To live only as one knows oneself, or to die to the known and face the unknown. To stay in that crystalline matrix or reach beyond it.
That tension, who knew it would show up in the form of a serpent?
Who knew indeed? I'd never seen him in the garden. And when I did, I simply started to talk with him. Why should he have been any different from the other creatures? And we had such interesting conversation. It sparked a question in my mind, a curiosity. Would we really die if we ate that fruit? He was so patient with my wonder about that. He assured me. He explained, no, we wouldn't die, not really. Certainly not immediately. He was right. If you've noticed, we're still here.
Now, may I remind you, my dear, we are archetypes. Archetypes do not die.
Don't get pedantic with me, husband. It's unbecoming. I tried to explain it to you then. I'll try again. He said we wouldn't die, but we would understand something dualistic, something binary about ourselves and the world. So our state of ignorance of such things would die, because we'd be able to discern good from evil, and that would simply make things clearer. We might even realize how very different we are from one another.
I know, but also in that moment, I began to desire you so much more, and you would have that power to withhold yourself from me. I hated that you might choose to do that. I needed to exert my strength and my power over you before I lost my sense of self.
And that fear has harmed the both of us, hasn't it? You know I hesitated, but here's the thing, Adam. I regret what the storytellers did with this, but I will never regret my decision. Do you remember why I did it? Why I reached for that fruit? I reached in a desire to know wisdom. I dared to want to know more, so I reached. That act, that reaching for consciousness, it was a necessary wounding.
And what came next was paradise shattering.
It was, I know. Such crashing awareness of our vulnerability, such a stripping away of our naivete, so brutal to know ourselves uncovered, seen, naked. I remember later holding Cain. He saw me looking at him more intensely than he could tolerate, even as I looked with love. He turned his sweet face away. The gaze was too intense. The power of our gazes left us feeling so exposed to one another.
It was an archetypal experience, to be emotionally laid bare, to be psychologically so naked. It filled us with shame, both of us, to realize so suddenly that we weren't in harmony with one another, that we weren't in harmony with the way we saw ourselves, that we were so naked in our differences. It caused us such anxiety.
It brought on self-punishment from within.
And cultural punishment from without.
That shame. I've watched it in this species that patterns itself after us. They loathe shame so much. They go to such terrible lengths to defend against it. It silences the vulnerable.
It makes the powerful more aggressive.
Is that what the masculine still fears, Adam? Feeling exposed? Is that why you're always trying to stay 3 steps ahead of shame? What does your kind fear that makes it cling so tightly to the structures of privilege?
That shame, that feeling of weakness, of needing another, of needing you so badly. The feeling is unbearable. I think my kind fears having to face this very concern, this protest of yours, too long dormant, but always alive. If we stop hiding behind power, we will know shame and need again.
I think I can see that. Yes. Well, that's what happened. Suddenly we knew we were naked, vulnerable, human, different. Suddenly we knew discord and disagreement, and all this knowing awakened something paradise itself could not contain.
Paradise could not contain shame.
I know. And that leads to the terms we must renegotiate now. Because it was in that punishment that all the twisting, all the misshaping and deforming of our true selves started. We were the best of the masculine and feminine archetypes, and then it all went south. Everyone was punished. The serpent, condemned to crawl on his belly, to live in perpetual shadow. You, condemned to toil and lust. God himself condemned to separate from his beloved creation.
He couldn't walk in the garden anymore either. The symbol that united us broke away. Some might say that our thirdness, that space between us, has been subjugated ever since.
Indeed it has. Yet only separateness, only separate substances can unite. And for my crime, Adam, for my crime, for opening our eyes to our vulnerability, I had the same punishment as you and more. For my curiosity, for my willingness to question and reach beyond the great no. My body was cursed. Childbirth would be painful. I would feel desire for you, but you would rule over me. What was that about? Adam, in this story, in this ancient story that still informs so many people's storied lives, my body was appropriated. I was moved to a place of subjugation in extremis, and you were moved to a position of superiority over me that, in your best moments, I'm not sure you ever really wanted.
Consciousness was the womb giver. We tipped out of balance, and the feminine became the great scapegoat.
Responsible for the suffering of humankind. But here's where they got it wrong, Adam. Shame wasn't born from an error in judgment. Shame was born from simple awareness of our vulnerability. It's an archetypal human condition. It doesn't say that we're incredibly, inescapably wrong, only that humankind is inescapably vulnerable. And seeing how it has dealt with its vulnerability, how it has projected it into the feminine and assaulted it there, how is that not heartbreaking? But it's easier to deal with it by blaming, isn't it? So I was blamed. A tidy way to justify the feminine as lesser, to relegate the masculine to that heady and greater height. from which it has always feared falling. Adam, in stripping our story of its poetry, in concretizing it so, this culture has tread on, has crushed the feminine way of knowing. If ever there were a great crime to be uncovered, that was it.
Eve, why is this on your mind?
As the bard once said, Adam, if you have tears, prepare to shed them now. Why is this on my mind? Do you think it has no bearing on what's at hand today? Look at these women, these angered women speaking on behalf of the injured feminine. Look at the vulnerable of any and all gendering. Look at them saying, no more to this imbalance.
Malcolm Gladwell might call it a true tipping point.
Bully for him. Terms.
But what are we tipping from and what are we tipping into, Eve?
We've seen enough stirring. What do they call them? Social movements. We've seen enough of them to know that they mirror something to a culture, something that a culture must understand about itself. They offer correctives to a collective. They show people what they've denied and minimized, tolerated, even colluded with. And of recent, I witness a movement that is rewriting the very biases for which storytellers hold you and me responsible. We have to correct the record.
I know those biases fuel the struggle, the cycle of abuse between the powerful and the vulnerable. But Eve, this isn't completely about a war between women and men.
No, of course it isn't. It's a struggle between the voiced and the unvoiced, between the interplay of sex and power, between secrecy and disclosure, between the use of shame to silence and the use of voice to break that silence. Adam, the main protagonist in this play, is the female body, and how the culture lays claim to it. Who owns it? Who has a right to it? Who takes it? Who gives it space? How is it appropriated? How is it objectified in youth and punished for daring to age? How is it projected onto and into? And how can it be freed of these constrictions? These questions come down to one single question. Is the person who inhabits the female form seen as an it or a thou? That's the question at the heart of this new emergence. That's the demand, Adam. Those are the terms. Mutual recognition of the person who inhabits the body of the more vulnerable.
This movement of the feminine voice, I see it calling out cultural shadow. I see it prying open toxic secrets. You're demanding that I see, that I take into myself the systemic abuse born of unchallenged power. And this is so tremendously difficult for me, Eve.
Systemic abuse that the misinterpretation of our story has fueled for generations. Terms, Adam. We were the original alchemists. Arum nostrum non est arum vulgi. Our gold is not the common gold. But Adam, arum meum non est arum tuum. My gold is not your gold. I will never regret my decision, but I require this now. If we would see the feminine in her right to stand in full equivalence with the masculine so that both might be healed, we have to reach. We must reach for mutual recognition, for thirdness, for the compassionate witnessing of true thirdness. Only that will envelop bias. Only that will give birth to clarity. Adam, I know an aging patriarchy rules here, and that when the feminine reaches, this patriarchy will push back, that something in you will long to push back, that there will be attempts to clip my wings and silence my voice and exile my body into states of itness. The feminine will reach anyway. Lunar consciousness is emerging. Our daughters know the strength of its intuition. They taste the expanse of its energy. they feel the greening under their feet. The feminine insists that this ancient polarizing between us be transformed, that the base and easy path of blame and scapegoating be abandoned. The feminine will reach for self-compassion in the place of shame. Our daughters and granddaughters will reach for sovereignty of self. They will no longer tolerate their bodies being there for the taking. The feminine will no longer tolerate it. You must no longer tolerate it. Can you not see that when you attempt to extinguish my lunar consciousness, you extinguish it in yourself as well? Adam, I will reach for this with you or without you, for I must. The feminine is bringing her voice to bear. But husband, today I have felt your compassionate witness. I know it's not too late for true syzygy. And I believe it would be more healing for all if we did this together and allow for true thirdness. Once again.
I've been in your blind spot, been there all along. Shadows do constrain me, but something here is wrong. My life began to fade when first I could not speak, but instincts they will rise in me. I'm not so very weak, and something here is really wrong. Silence is betrayal. All the things I dare not say, but I'm not content to carry all your sins away. Reach, I will become that winged horse. Reach and take up that golden sword. Reach until truth is restored. You can punish me for speaking, and you can scoff at me for age, but you can't contain the agony, and you can't deny this rage. 'Cause something here is wrong. Silence is betrayal. All the things I did not say, but I'm not content to carry all these sins away. Reach, I will become that winged horse. Oh, reach and take up that golden sword. Reach until truth it is restored. You and I will make it in our differences. You and I and love. Let's slice the silence, speak the words, and break this unspoken vow. Reach, I will become that winged horse. Reach, take up that golden sword. Reach until justice is restored. Reach, I am that winged horse. Reach I dare not say. But I'm not content to carry all your sins away. Reach, I will become that winged horse. Reach and take up that golden sword. Reach until truth is restored.
Well, that was really nicely done. You know, I really like the idea of going back and reprogramming core programming and recognizing that Adam and Eve is like it's like a card at the bottom of the house of cards. You know, it's if you want to go to the fulcrum point, you know, it's one of the bottommost points to rework and reprogram. And, you know, I think it's one of the stories we should be, whatever the thing is that you need to say and want to say can be said through a reworking of the story of Adam and Eve. So I think very timely, obviously, of course, but those are secondary comments. I just want to pause on how cool it is to go back and do some reprogramming of the core programming.
Can we quote you on that, Will?
Please, yeah.
The idea of thinking of it as the card at the bottom or something, it's just been such a foundational story for the West, and I think it's a legitimate protest to say that maybe the interpretation originally, that coding was maybe not the best, or how to say it. It's nice to reprogram it. It's timely. I'll just agree with you there.
You know, I'll ask a question. I'm curious. To what extent, you know, because I know the feminine and masculine and male and female, those divisions, I'm sure, are very comfortable, you know, for you. I wonder if you could speak to who was Eve speaking for? To what extent was she speaking for women? And to what extent was she speaking for the feminine? And maybe by avoiding a direct answer, you'll give us a better, you know, frame it better.
In some ways, I think that she was speaking for the vulnerable, and the experience of vulnerable, which in some ways varies person to person, and in some ways, I think there are foundational vulnerabilities that we have that are common to human beings, and I think she's speaking for that, and as in following up on what Gus's talk was, and prior talks, one that Diane has given, of this consideration that within solar consciousness resides some lunar consciousness, and vice versa, and how can those escape to be known and not oppressed by others, self-oppressed.
And I know for me, and there's even a Gus card in this, that it's always surprising that something happens in the middle of this dialogue that just grips me, you know, when we did it live. In terms of that, I was sort of kind of, you know, leaning on the podium and kind of nonchalant. And then there's something about, you know, Carolyn and her presentation and of course our relationship and what I know of her, that all of a sudden I was in the grips of this thing and really like questioning in terms of like, what is it to be a man? And we had the idea of compassionate witnessing and that I was doing that. And I didn't find it as strong today, but during that presentation, I wanted to like crack a joke. I wanted to break. It was so powerful and gripping, and having to stay with it and what it really means for compassionate witnessing to stay and to hear that and to face that. And I still, you know, it's a body experience. It kind of comes up from the solar plexus and grips me that way. So some of the men in the audience were even kind of saying, "Oh, you know, oh my, you know, you're a good actor and stuff." I don't know about acting. It was like I was in the grips of the archetype itself.
Well, you know, each of us has a vulnerability and a power center within us. And they kind of shift in balance as we operate either emotionally or intellectually in terms of the things that we do, the people we meet, and how we go about finding our way down a path that we may or may not know where we're going. But some part of us wants to know where we're going. And it is that part of us that kills off the vulnerable part that says, you know, if I don't know where I'm going, any path can get me there. And the bounds of uncertainty grow in direct proportion to the way in which we are vulnerable to this feminine spirit of birthing new consciousness within ourselves. It's the masculine analytical recognition pattern type side that kind of like submerges that part of ourselves. It gets rid of curiosity when it fears curiosity.
So I found the most impressive part of this really wonderful performance, I don't know quite what to call it, but dialogue or conversation was about shame and power and vulnerability. That seemed to me to be the core piece of it. And we always get confused when it becomes sort of gender based. If it's who's causing the shame and who's causing the vulnerability, is it a man doing that to a woman or a woman doing that to man? And those power struggles are pretty old. And I think it's very easy to fall into the gender side of this, and then for men to feel like they're the victims, or for women to feel like they're the victims, and then you're on a sort of merry-go-round. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is how this expresses itself not in individuals, but in groups. And my major focus over the last 20 or 30 years has been cultural complexes or group complexes. And I'm really impressed with how many groups right now, nationally, regionally, nationally, globally, are claiming victimhood against some oppressor. And of course, right now, Dana, as you mentioned, the prime horrific example of that is Russia and Ukraine. I mean, there seems to be a clear, brutal aggressor and a true victim of that brutality. It's about as clear as we've seen in a long time, I think. Maybe that's why there's such a relief and a rally around the democratic principle, because suddenly we can all come together around something. But I feel in our kind of day-to-day cultural life, we're bombarded with claims of victimhood by just about every group that's crying out for attention and reparation. And I don't have to name any group, because we can all name 10 groups probably. And I think that claim of victimhood and abuse and vulnerability is overwhelming, actually, to all of us. And I don't know how you find the thou from the it when there's so many groups crying out in the name of their victimhood. So I'll just throw that into the pot, stir the pot a bit, maybe.
Thank you, Tom. I think that this consideration that shame is an archetypal human condition and vulnerability is an archetypal human condition, and to be alive to it and see, if we might, the strength in it, but to require mutual recognition and recognition for the spirit that resides in the body or country of the more vulnerable. And so the pull is always for mutuality, and that is so hard when polarization begins to happen between people, between clusters and groups, between countries. When polarizing begins to happen, we don't do the extra, very hard work of where is the thou in what I am facing. Where is the thou and the humanity in it? And until we can do that, the tensions remain. They always remain.
Do you think it's more human to polarize and split than to find the third and the thou? Just a question.
I don't. I think it's easier.
It's easier. Good.
I was thinking about, I think it's a really interesting thing you're pointing out, Tom, the idea that it's part of the landscape right now. And I think that's telling about where we are collectively right now, that this is, as I think you're, where you're going with it. And I think what's so interesting to me is that it's telling us the myth that we're in. And the myth that does that is the myth of Prometheus versus Zeus, the rebel versus the tyrant, the person that's being stomped on by the tyrant that overthrows the tyrant. And this is the American myth. This is the myth of America overthrowing the tyranny of the queen, overthrowing the Nazis, Civil War, you name it, women's rights, civil rights, always. It's always the oppressed fighting for their rights against the tyrant. This is the recurring myth of individualism. And that's the foundation of the Western psyche. And so what I think we're seeing is we're in a period where, as Eliade described, we renew our identity by renewing our myths. We retell our creation stories when we go through our New Year's cycles. And so we're going through a renewal process for democracy and individualism at the same time, which is why everybody's all of a sudden cares about their downtrodden individualism, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time that we're reaching a level of wasteland of oppression, real true wasteland of oppression of the feminine, oppression of marginalized voices. And it isn't just, a whole bunch of voices feel this way. It's systemically gargantuan, the level of oppression, in the systemic level of oppression, and the systemic level of the oppression, not just of women, but of all the feminine metaphors, the body, the emotions, etc. And they're so obviously ready to be integrated. There's such an obvious upswelling ready for this. So I think what we see a collective retelling of this myth in motion. And I hope that we won't be calling out about how we're all victims for long. I hope that this is the beginning of a narrative. And I hope that when we do retell the story, we retell our creation myth as we're doing tonight, with Adam and Eve.
Well, that's a very passionate statement, and I fully affirm it. What happens, unfortunately, is when the polarizing goes on, you listen to Putin accusing the Ukrainians of being Nazis, and in this age of disinformation or whatever, everybody's gotten so clever at projecting the victimhood onto themselves and the oppressor onto somebody else. And so you don't even know who's who the cast of characters are.
Well, and of course, and Putin's presenting himself as a victim himself, as you're saying, right? Yeah. The question is, if we've reached something that is black and white enough, if we've reached a point where there is something black and white enough that we can, 3 years ago, people were saying, asking me, isn't the country going to tear itself apart? And I was saying 3 years ago, I said, when a bad guy knocks on the doors, the brothers are going to stop fighting each other and deal with the bad guy knocking on the door. And you could see 10 years ago, if you were really paying more attention than I was, that the level of competition between the U.S. and its competitors is reaching an actual competitive point. And as that happens, there's going to be some things that start to trump normal narratives, like economics will start to get trumped by national narratives and all this stuff. So I was sure that bad guy was going to be knocking on the door, a few years ago. And I think other people saw it 10 years ago, that this polarization was just always destined to be reconciled by common cause. But that's something I'm counting on right now, and we'll see if it actually bears out.
I wonder if I could say something here. I was really, in the presentation, Gus, I thought you seemed almost like it was hard. You seemed quite emotional. And but in a quiet way. And Carolyn, you were so passionate and articulate. And I was looking at the two of you and thinking about masculine and feminine qualities, and how you didn't identify as male being masculine and female being feminine, or what we call those cultural ideas of masculine and feminine. And I really liked that. And I also noticed in the discussion how quickly we moved away from the very personal interchange between what it is to be a man and a woman embodying male and female, the two of you together. This very original thing where it's only the two of you in the world, in the Adam and Eve, the creation story. And I was imagining something I would have just would want to add is, could we bring imagination in to this dialogue? Could a woman ask a man to try to imagine what it would be like to be in a woman's body, to be acted toward as a woman, and not to be one of the good old boys, or to ask a woman what it would be like to be a man and to have to be one of the good old boys, or to be that, because there's so much suffering for both. And we see that, of course, in our practices with those, with all of that. So I felt like you were opening my imagination and my passion, as well as my receptivity, were both stimulated by what you did tonight. And I really appreciated that.
And thank you, Diane. But the being the grips, that's where it sort of felt like, am I not being manly? Right? Like I was actually in the feeling of that, and listening to the kind of persecution, perpetration upon the female body. Instead, in the original thing, I had this, because I presented the passion and the Pieta image, and it was almost like a turnaround that was like holding the female body. And yet there was, I think, as you say, that power kind of, in it that was really fearful. When, we were working out some of the dialogue, I mean, it was really Carolyn's dialogue, but some of the parts of the needing, that I added, like that awareness of the power that comes through the need and the refusal was really that kind of, core part that I got in touch with. That originally I said, I felt there was some need to like protect my crotch from that. And I had a number of men come up in the audience and were going, oh, I'm so glad you said that, because I kind of, felt that, like, that there was indeed a sort of thread upon kind of, the malehood. But, that's what I think we were trying to get through or beyond, or so it's so nice to hear that some of that actually, came through.
You said there was a question?
Yeah, there's a question down the Q&A. Didn't this framing of the story and the denigration of Eve predate her arrival on the scene? Wasn't she created after Lilith rejected the terms she would have had to live under with Adam?
Indeed. Indeed, she was. She was second wife, and in a way, perhaps in the background, all these millennia later, has been in strong dialogue with, and curious dialogue with Lilith, because Lilith took that empowerment and said, I will not yield. It was still non-relational. And so one of the questions in this dialogue is about how do we hold vulnerability and power in a relational way.
I think the one thing you brought up right there was what I didn't hear in the dialogue between the two of you, which was Eve having her vulnerability and then, as Tom said, becoming a victim of it. I didn't hear Eve, grousing about all of the misfortunes that had followed her, her, if you will, her fall from taking the fruit and, developing awareness or consciousness and all of that. There seemed to be a really active pursuit of recognizing what her role was, but just understanding that the two of them, Adam and Eve, really were a unified part of a whole that somehow or another had been wedged apart. And I feel that vulnerability is one of those core creative principles that if we can maintain it without falling into victimhood about it, we can do something with it. But as soon as we become a victim, it's kind of like a cry for help or something. I don't know. I don't know. Never really responded to being a victim, although I have compassion for people whose lives really are misfortunate. I mean, it's not a good situation.
I think one of the double binds that we can get into as human beings is trying to outrun shame, trying to outrun vulnerability, rather than the sheer acceptance of the fact of them and the strength in that acceptance. We spend tremendous amount of energy trying to get away from that. The two very potentially present can jump up at the drop of a hat to take over and silence one's own voice, and that is gender non-specific. That happens in people.
You're not equating vulnerability with shame, though.
No. I am saying that we have, I think, a problem feeling that we interpret our vulnerability as shameful. Mm-hmm. And thus we run from it.
So in other words, one's marginalized nature, whether it's a size or a physical characteristic or an intellectual or an intelligent, whatever it happens to be, if we feel somehow deficient or not as good or one thing and another, that then becomes shameful.
I wonder how we might reconcile that with the Greek versions of these stories with Pandora, of course. But in those stories, Prometheus delivers all this knowledge except for shame. Shame comes from Hermes. It comes later. And it said that civilization couldn't exist until Hermes brought shame. I thought I'd throw that on the pile. What do you think? Do you think there's something to that? I've always wrestled with that. Do I really believe that? I don't know. Do we need shame?
Well, I think without shame, we might be at risk for identifying with the gods.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
It reminds us of our humanity in a very painful way.
I'm thinking about leaders leaders without shame. Very interesting. Yeah. Destructive. And the other thing that's interesting to parallel with Pandora is that Pandora, unlike Eve, like Eve and Pandora, they're both the first women, but Eve is kind of more of a vacuum, whereas Pandora, there's so clearly other women and other relationships. Pandora has a wife, and Prometheus has a wife, Asia, and has positive relationships with Athena and all that stuff. So it's more contextualized that Pandora is specifically given to be this curse. She's this cursed person. She's not like just womanhood. She is this cursed gift, which then gets equated to women. Sorry, go ahead.
But one of the fundamental differences may be that Pandora is part of a system of myth that is there's a panoply of gods,
mm-hmm.
and Eve was born into monotheistic faith.
And so then when you've got to narrow women or femininity down to one archetype, now it might get narrowed down into good or bad way too easy, instead of all this manyness. we're doing Passion of the Western Mind for my philosophy class, and that I'm teaching. And one of the things I'm always so moved by is the way that he can help us see how Western thought made, a decision between male and female metaphors. Every decision they made for thousands of years, they leaned left towards the masculine, or whatever direction you want to make it, and so the devaluing of body, the devaluing of emotion, the devaluing of, and I can't stand here and say what's masculine and feminine, but what was recognized as, and the things that were recognized as feminine were specifically split off, and the body itself, it's not, more than Eve's body, just all body was associated with feminine, our relationship with anybody. And that's something I'm so inspired by, to work with these dancers, is to see them think and live and work through their body as we work through these philosophy conversations. I'm hoping that that's where the world's going. I like to think that I believe that we're getting closer to our bodies again.
I want to go back to what Diane said. I thought she made a very good point to bring the discussion back to the embodiment of the Adam and Eve story in how Carolyn and Gus did it, and how personal it was, and I think this kind of discussion is complex, because we go back and forth between very personal and individual, and I think Gus and Carolyn did a beautiful job of that. And it raises these archetypal themes, and in fact, they're embodying the conceit, if you will, is that this is an archetypal discussion. So I think we get thrown back and forth between what feels very personal and intimate with regard to shame and vulnerability and power, and then what's sort of archetypally built into these things in terms of various creation myths. I kept thinking of the Kabbalistic myth of creation as an alternative, because it doesn't put it in gender terms, but basically it says that the wholeness of the creation could not hold. And therefore, fragmentation is built into our reality. And that we all are, in a sense, carry fragmentation, whether it be around gender roles or power roles or vulnerable. That fragmentation is inherent to our being human beings, and the work of being a human being is so-called tikkun, where you're trying to bring it all back together. One thing I like about that myth is kind of a helpful compensation is this way: is it doesn't locate it in gender specifically. It locates it in the human being, of which we all are carriers of that fragmentation.
Now, one of the things in my presentation, too, was trying to, look at the psychology of the perpetrator, and kind of, that there are two different ways of reacting, that the perpetrator is really denigrating and putting down these lunar qualities, of body and feeling around that. I think the problem that I didn't really address in the presentation is the problem of psychopathy, because it's a whole different animal kind of in this way. And even though, a lot of the psychopaths have terrible traumatic backgrounds, they really do. This book, The Psychopath Test, when I read that, it was like, really opened my mind of, wow, this is like a whole subspecies of Homo sapien. They're wired differently. The brains are different. They react to stimuli, pain differently around that. And it's like, like all bets are off on our psychology around that, because you can't, I don't know about the compassionate witnessing, where it kind of, comes into play when you're dealing with that, which I think is almost evil, right? I mean, it's the best word for talking about it.
Have you seen, Gus, there's just came out recently, there's a new study by, I guess they're sort of evolutionary biologists and psychologists, and they're questioning the DSM diagnosis of psychopathy, because they're arguing that it's actually an evolutionary development, that we evolution now is favoring the development of the psychopath, and we should remove it from the DSM category.
I said subspecies, but I think they would say superspecies.
Yeah.
In terms of that.
It's how
then you got to ask yourself, do you think that the world, but then what are you trying to get to replicate itself, the individual or the collective? Okay, maybe those individuals are better at replicating themselves as individuals, but do they make the species better at replicating itself as a species? I doubt it. Hyper-individualism as a myth built in, that's quite a thing. Thanks for mentioning that. Gosh, there's no congressman to write on that one, is there?
No. It's part of the book, if you read that Psychopath Test, and he kind of gives the history of it in the background and treatment and how they even use treatment to become better psychopaths. And then the whole second part of the book is that CEOs, he started giving the test to CEOs and politicians, and that these are the people that gravitate there because of the power gradient in terms of that they can do the most in those positions.
So compassionate witnessing wouldn't be very helpful with that subspecies.
Yeah. Well, I think it's sort of, you think of like the Indiana Jones one where the guy is swinging the knife around, and he could have compassionate witnessing to him before he shoots him. Instead of like engaging them. I talked to my partner, she's in the Buddhist, and she's going, no, Buddhism is not just like passively accepting it. There's an active Buddhism around it, that there has to be some other energy. But I think the compassionate witnessing somehow is in there because that is still damaging to one, right? Even just
Interesting.
it.
Do you think that the most psychopathic or sociopathic or the most, they're hiding from themselves, right? The most. So is the witnessing just creating mirrors that make it harder to hide from themselves? Like Tai Chi guiding somebody's negative energy just right into the, ground or something.
Well, I think that there is such a severing with certain psychopathy. There's just such a severing between power and and the embodied, and so much invested that the capacity to bridge that, we can't always build bridges, can we?
Yeah, I'm struck by how Adam and Eve in the Islamic in the Quran, they fall far away from each other. Really, really far. And in the Georgian books of Adam and Eve, they can't see each other. They their eyes change, they go into the cave and all that stuff. But that extreme sense of separation is, I think, such a clear consequence of the hyper-individualism that they leave the garden with. And that experience of separation and estrangement is, I think it's part of where we're at right now. What you guys are talking about, I'm not sure I have a great bridge between them, but what you're talking about with the sociopathy and psychopathy being potentially removed from the DSM seems horrifyingly consistent with the hyper-individualism that goes back to core code as early as the story of Eden.
If we're going to play, let's open up the sandbox to more people. Our next visitor, Dennis, you're muted.
This is just such a marvelous discussion. I want to thank you all, and Carolyn and Gus, for that dramatic presentation. My own work in the last 2 years has been on the mythology of beliefs, and reading in neuroscience, the observations, the research showing that once a belief finds its way into one's mythos, into one's psyche, trying to dislodge it or to change it is really to go against the whole neurological cosmos that allows us to have beliefs and to hang on to them. So it's if I can bring in another Greek god, it's Herculean to try to change someone's belief. And I don't think it's going to happen with statistics, but as you all have been speaking and Will has been highlighting, it's going to happen with a change in the story. and then there's a chance. So I just wanted to pop that in because I think we're talking about beliefs, and they're sometimes incorrigible power. Yeah.
Aren't beliefs by nature, don't they aspire to be solar? That is, to connect with the head, and that somehow or another, if we can believe something into reality, then we are kind of denying that lunar emphasis within ourselves, that feeling that we just really don't understand what it's all about. But it's like we don't believe in our family. Has a kind of like an integral archetypal base. We believe in our relationships. We believe in the things that are the part of life that guide us. But those are all solar. Those are all things that we have constructed through education, through teaching. And I would ask Gus if that's in fact the way psychology works, not being the token non-psychologist in this group, and Will
And me.
and Dennis.
Well, I know that one of the things, Carolyn and I, this is actually the third time that we did it, originally in that a group asked us to present it. And then, this time we were kind of saying, clearly we're not doing it, it's doing us. It's been like a working each time. I think that's what grips me. I get more conscious of my own kind of microaggressions, more aware kind of, with the MeToo movement. And as Carolyn is presenting kind of, this litany of crimes, and then that connection with how I've done that to myself, right? And had a different belief, right, about who I was, and thought I was, this, and then all of a sudden this kind of raises it. It's like, not the chauvinist kind of in this way, but yeah, all of these more micro elements and how they manifest, and it's like, oh my God, in terms of, that you start becoming more aware. I think that's what's happening as we get worked in this.
I suppose we could have had a dialogue between the right and left hemispheres of the brain, but it just wouldn't have been the same, And when Dennis brings up neuroscience, and I wonder about whether beliefs are tend towards solar, or where do they begin? Because some beliefs begin in implicit relational knowing, which are the layers of nonverbal, pre-verbal experiences that we have in the very, very early parts of our lives. That if we cry out, someone will come, or if we cry out, no one will come. That we learn and learn and learn before there's language. And that, I believe, is pretty much stored over there in the right hemisphere. I mean, that's the embodied beginnings, genesis of what will become beliefs.
Yes.
I think.
I agree, Carolyn. And I think, number one, you've brought me closer to a felt relationship with Eve than I've ever had. So I wanted to share that with all of you, but directed towards Carolyn. I think that beliefs can be cellular in their origin. I mean, I grew up in a violent alcoholic household. My father, quiet during the week, a raging, I'm not sure what, on the weekends. And we lived in that week in and week out, year in and year out. Well, so much of how I was shaped and formed and came to thinking about things came out of the ferocious anxiety that I and my brothers and sister had seared into our cellular structure. I think over time, to witness Dana's point, that they became cognitive as I aged, but I think their origin was in the cells of our young developing bodies.
You know, I wonder, as you're talking quite movingly about beliefs and what's embodied, Jung's work on complexes, of course, comes to mind, and kind of maybe the relationship between complexes and beliefs, which I imagine is fairly hard to tease out. But one of the things about there's several things about complexes. They're autonomous. They have a memory of their own that's self-selecting. They have simplistic ideas that are usually black and white. And so the cognition is simplistic. The affect is deep. It's not really differentiated feeling. And the memories are self-selecting. And so when are we in the realm of a complex, and when are we in the realm of a belief? That's a question.
No, it's a good one. It's a good one.
I was so impressed, Carolyn and Gus, with the personal way that you conveyed all of this in the relationship itself, that, you gave us such a sense of, as a woman, sort of the voice that's coming forward that we've carried for centuries, really. And to think about how the voice of the feminine has been evolving over hundreds of years and getting to this point now where we can really see it in the context of the personal relationship, like you guys played out, which was lovely. And then to see sort of what's up to us now, sort of how do we learn from the past rather than blaming it or staying caught up in it? How do we take what we can learn from it and move into this new paradigm, this new way of relating? And I just thought it was masterful. It was so beautiful how you guys conveyed all of that in the context of a personal relationship. So it's not all of our psychological ideas about this. It's very gripping into our bodies and into our feelings and into our vulnerable places. So, it was just wonderful. It really was very stimulating in that way for me. So thank you.
Thank you, Gita.
Oh, thank you. One of the things that came out in the audience, somebody said, boy, you could really tell how much you two love one another. And I think that's the container for it, the love and the trust that allowed us to do this, and seeking out Carolyn in the first place, and then that wonderful, insight of hers to do this.
And to be so vulnerable for the two of you. You're coming up against a culture that is very attached to this belief, talk about beliefs and this myth and what this myth means, and challenging that, that's big.
I think part of it is that interweaving of, Will was talking about the separation, that interweaving of lunar and solar consciousness that came up in not only Gus's presentation, but earlier in one of, I think, Diane, in one of your presentations, of how do we connect to and allow to be in us both of those ways of knowing, both of those ways, and can they find harmony? And when they don't find harmony, what's up? Probably what Tom is, I go to what Tom is saying. When they're not in harmony, a complex is come into the garden to invite the conscious mind to reach a little bit and understand what more is there to know. The serpent was a little bit like Hermes.
Yeah. And, just I'm glad you brought that up, Carolyn, because I was thinking, what role finally does the animal play in this dialogue, this relationship? it's earthy, it's connected, it's just a rich third, if I can use that. It's a rich tertium quid between Adam and Eve, and I don't know if it's been given its due as part of the animal soul, as a representative of the animal soul. Yeah.
And what kind of consciousness does it call us to?
Exactly right.
Out, because we don't get to live in paradise. We just don't get to live in paradise.
Yes.
Life's much more complicated than that.
Yes. And your line, I was typing notes. I've got 3 or 4 pages of typed notes on my other computer. And Eve, your line to Adam, if you extinguish my lunar consciousness, you extinguish it in yourself. I mean, that relational quality of what I'm doing to you, I'm doing to me, really is worth contemplation. Yeah.
That's so much, Dennis. I just that thing, that turn is so important to all this. It's not just about how women are being treated. It's about how men are treating their inner feminine.
That's right.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And that is very huge. That's a huge thing. I'm sorry, Dennis, go ahead.
No. And then Adam followed with, I felt your compassionate witnessing. And it was either right after it or very close to and then I typed end of dialogue. So that happened right at the end. It was like
Eve says that. Eve says that.
Oh, Eve does. Sorry,
No.
I was trying to catch Adam and Eve and getting the right lines, but thank you. No.
And a little plug that this paper will be coming out in Psychological Perspectives in a month or two. It's in its final galleys. So
good.
We thought this would be a nice forum to get it out there and promote the paper.
Beautiful.
I would like to put a plug in for the song that went with the PowerPoint. My dear friend and colleague, Patty Ruth Stewart, attended that lecture and was something in it worked on her and worked in her, and she went home and wrote that song. She's a singer here in Austin, a psychologist and a singer, and made it as a gift to me. And it felt to me when I received it like it encapsulated the whole thing. It just encapsulated the tension and the requiring that both these kinds of energies ask of one another.
Well, as Dennis was saying earlier, when you, or quoting a line from Eve, if you wound me, you wound yourself. But by contrast, if I heal you, if I'm providing you with the soul's redemption or honoring, then I do that also to myself.
Yeah.
And so the idea of finding that seed of assisting or witnessing or compassion in another person is to unlock that potential within ourselves and to bring that and make it public. I mean, it's the sort of thing that we do that we suddenly are not embarrassed by acting in an emotional way. We're not putting on a pretense, and we're not doing something. We're exposing our vulnerabilities and allowing them, to come forth and do their healing.
And Eve, you're the one that brought in the place of poetry. You say, and I'm not sure I've got the context, but we're stripping our lives of its poetry. And you maybe can help with the context of that, but that is another one of those lines that runs really deep. And one of my habits in my morning meditation ritual is that I don't start writing in my journal until I've read one or two poems from anthologies with women poets, men poets, and the centering that simply reading the poems, and sometimes I'll read them aloud, is astonishing in their power. Yeah.
The way of thinking about any creation story or any faith, that when the poetry of it is stripped away, there can be no symbolic thought. There can be no symbolic experience. It is what it is. Wow. It's concretized. It's concretized. Yes. And that, going back to what Will began this this panel discussion with, is about recoding. Is that how you said it, Will? Mm-hmm. Can we recode and recapture the poetry of what it is to be human and vulnerable with one another?
Right.
You know, I wonder what it would be like if we each sat down and rewrote the Adam and Eve myth. Using our lunar consciousnesses to imagine into it in some way. I don't know what would happen, but it would be a wonderful exercise. And perhaps in a poetic way. Yes. To do it poetically. Yeah. If we have that ability, you know.
And maybe from the snake's perspective, the serpent's perspective. I wonder what the serpent would have to say about it all.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there is, if any of you are really curious about that, I highly recommend you check out the Yazidi version of the Garden of Eden, because this is the story told by the Syrians who descend from the Assyrians, who told the story from Satan's perspective, and where he's not the bad guy, where actually he is the peacock angel who selects the king on earth for the divine. There's this whole thing. And to this day, the Yazidi have been seen as devil worshippers by a lot of Muslims. And so this is why ISIS committed genocide against the Yazidi, because they still are trapped in the same myth. Oh, those people are telling devil's side of the story. They're devil worshippers of the Eden myth. We've got to.
And that's the concretizing. That's the concretizing.
Totally.
There's also the tie-in from my presentation of the woman trapped in the serpent in the tomb, sort of make this allusion to it that is also the beginning place of this consciousness that Carolyn was bringing into the, and if we didn't do this, then this differentiation wouldn't occur. The individuation, really wouldn't be possible. That there is that kind of, melding in the garden.
Betty Sue Flowers just wrote in the chat box that it was Eve who had the relationship with the serpent.
Yes. Saw that.
And again, I weave that back into what you were saying, Dennis, about how does that which can really be embodied and chthonic down in the earth, how can that be claimed without laying claim to it?
Mm-hmm.
We start laying claim to things. We're kind of caught in power complexes.
Yes. Yeah. Beautifully said, Carolyn.
Somebody mentioned earlier that power drive stuff and how all the politicians and tend to be these people that profile. I think it was you, Tom. And I just I remember something Lance Smith pointed out about I'm trying to remember who it was, making sense of the punishments of the underworld and the punishment of Sisyphus and the punishment of Sisyphus as power seeking. And it's always struck me, you want to seek power, then you're going to get burdens. And, they get their own suffering. They're walking right into their own hell.
Yeah.
I think it was that statement too that I had, I found in Mysterium, I compulsion being the great mystery of the human personality around that. And so my comment but when you pair compulsion with power and privilege, you have a deadly combination. I was thinking of that too when you were saying, Tom, about the complex and it's also in that place. He goes, yeah, and is the compulsion coming from the complex or coming from the anthropos or the self that he's saying there? But then he kind of goes, in the end, the complex is connected with the self, and that it is all sort of leading back to the original center anyway, that it comes out maybe in this pathological form.
That reminds me, Gus, of something Joe Henderson said years ago, which is that the most unholy marriage in the psyche is, for a man, is the shadow and the anima, and particularly when it gangs up on the ego. Maybe that's where the power drive comes in, when the shadow and the anima get together in an unholy marriage and gang up on the ego. I mean, I've thought about that comment for years. I don't quite know what it means, but
I have a feeling you don't want to.
well, I've experienced it enough myself to know that it's very potent and problematic.
I've been looking at, I had to do a thing on Robin Hood, and this is where the villain becomes the good guy. And it's like, if you create a tyranny to the point where the villain is the good guy, then that's you're in a new space. So, if you push the shadow if it becomes a righteous alignment of shadow and anima, because that's what it takes to crack the ego's eclipse of all other light. It's, yeah, I think I've walked myself into that before.
So one of the things that comes to my mind is in doing trauma work, there are times certainly when trauma is disembodied or encapsulated, and I often think of trauma as orphaned, and that part of the work of trauma work is to bring the orphan home, to bring that experience home where it can find a place to live in some degree of relative peace in the psyche, or integrated peace in the psyche. And when I wanted to give the backstory of how Eve's voice came, because in the whole arc of this process of writing it with Gus, and our dialogues together, and our experiences, and then talking about it, fundamentally, I think that when her voice came into my head, it was a request to bring her home and bring her out of exile.
Yeah, it's great.
So it's connection that is what we yearn for. That the isolation of not having connection or feeling disconnected or disembodied is a source of what wounds the individual. It wounds the body, it wounds the psyche.
Disconnected from others, disconnected from vital elements in oneself.
And isn't that the ego's job? I mean, it seems to do a pretty good job of isolating itself from the other aspects of the psyche as well as from one another.
On its not so good days. Hopefully on its better days, in concert with the self. It's doing the business of individuation and coming into relationship with the disparate parts.
Carolyn, I really like what you said about bringing that voice home, and it brings me back to the Kabbalistic myth of fragmentation, which is that we have these bits and pieces of our psyche that do get split off, and we all have them. And bringing them home is sort of the work of individuation, I guess, is you bringing these broken off pieces, however they got broken off through trauma or whatever, or just a lack of development. That is the work of individuation, is to bring those fragmented pieces of ourself. And if it's the voice of Eve that you listen to, that's a huge piece of work.
Yeah.
That you did for all of us.
I'm still trying to live with some of the fractured parts of myself, while I'm not settling into that as a condition until the day I die. I'm really trying to befriend some of those fractures.
Yes.
So they're not of a piece, but they're pieces of me. And so it's almost paradoxical, but it seems necessary, because then the resisting of them starts to get modified. Yeah, that's where I am.
I totally agree with that. I think the problem with the myth of individuation is that somehow you're supposed to become whole. And maybe we have glimpses of that from time to time, but I agree with you. We live with fragmented pieces of ourselves, and hopefully we can get friendlier with them.
Yeah.
That's where the compassionate witnessing, I think, comes in.
There you are. Yeah.
No, that's great, Gus. That's exactly right.
That's right.
Thank you.
Both of you. I think that's the glutenum mundi, the world glue.
That's right. That's right.
I think that individuation is also relative to what's individuating. I think the biggest kind of delusion about individuation is that it's objective. It is a whole. It's like, well, there's certain parts of me I'm splitting off, and I'm going to try and integrate those parts this time. And by the way, 1,000 journeys happening at once and in different stages of what parts I'm integrating at any given time. You watch people you love and you care about integrating parts of themselves over time, over long periods of time.
Well, I think that it's the danger of the Jungian notion of individuation becoming reified. And then we use it as if we actually are all talking about the same thing, and probably we're not.
I hope individuation is the same for all of us. When you first came in, Dennis, you were talking about the challenge of getting somebody to change their mind, and you talked about changing myths, and I think that Socrates is so important to me because I think he was the ultimate expert in changing a mind. And I think that his path was the ultimate way to do it. And that is, you got to lead somebody into the doubt of their belief before you can start putting a new one in there. They've got to question the validity of themselves. And by the way, maybe even, and Socrates wasn't good at this, maybe even feel safe to do that questioning and deconstructing, to even be able to go there. But anyway, I just think that that's such an important thing and I hope that what's happened is that part of our hyper masculinity, hyper individuality is just running up against the wall where we're seeing it not work, where it's collapsing in our hands, and now we have to doubt it. And hopefully out of that doubt comes the space, to maybe allow in some new beliefs.
Yeah, that's great. Will, you're much closer to Socrates than I am, but I do remember reading one of the dialogues in which he was teaching by questioning and challenged, and he said, well, wait a minute, I'm just a midwife. That's all that I'm trying to do. I'm trying to midwife. And I love that, and the term might have been different in its understanding at that time, but it seemed that he was tapping the feminine part of the whole learning process, which is both masculine and feminine, it seems to me.
I think people miss that a lot with Socrates. He cared a lot about more than just thinking. Although I will say the problem, he perplexes me. The person he listens to more than anybody ever is Diotima, is a woman, period. That is his, and that's pretty special. at the same time, he's an ascetic, and he is all about subduing the influence of the body and the influence of the emotions. And this is one of the exact things where it turns into a hypermasculinity where it's subduing those things we recognize as feminine. And however, I think Socrates, like Buddha, that's a setup of an arc. If you look closer, the Buddha starts out as an ascetic, and then he turns from asceticism and he chooses to integrate, the body. And finally, when he's sitting in the center of the world, and the devil figure Mara says, how dare you sit in the center of the world? Who do you think you are? He reaches down and he touches the earth, and the earth trembles, of course, as though to say, this guy is integrated with the feminine. He turned to the feminine to give the answer, and so I think there's something to it. So I'm torn up over Socrates. Sometimes I think he's integrating the feminine. Sometimes I think he's not. I guess at the end of the day, he's not sure either.
He was of mixed minds about it.
Will, I'm much too old to hold all those stories in my mind. You're a marvel to me.
Yeah.
Maybe they just mean too much. I don't know.
Oh,
Well, and keep in mind what Socrates did was give something to somebody that was in themselves, so that he wasn't promoting a belief system. He was allowing somebody to come to a sense of knowledge or awareness that was already contained in the person.
Yeah, that's right.
And maybe that's where Eve was going with the compassionate witnessing. She is bringing forth awareness, wholeness from the various parts. As soon as she takes the fruit, they fall into pieces, and all of her attempts are about bringing this thing back together. It's reminds me of sounds that start, they inevitably fall away into silence. And so, speaking of silence, I would like to invoke a moment of silence as we go out from this wonderful myth salon, and Gus, Carolyn, Diane, Tom, Dennis, Gita, and of course my good friend Will. I'm so grateful that we're able to, construct something like this out of nothing, because we come from nothing. And as the Ursula Le Guin poem says, we come from dust, return to dust, and everything, it's all dust. We are a community, breathing life into ourselves one moment at a time, one person at a time. Thank you all. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful evening.